afternoon. Welcome back to my unscheduled live stream. Today I'll be reading The Diary of a Veteran, which is from my collection of short stories and poems, The Dying God and Other Stories. I reread this, incidentally, last night in preparation for today, and, you know, it's not great, but I did write it 10 years ago, so it'll have to do. Grab yourself a cup of tea. Ready? Diary of a Veteran. I know you will never believe this. Not in a million years will you believe what I have seen and am now relaying to you. I'm telling you all the same. It will probably be many years after my death that you are reading this. I'm an old man now, and no one cares about the memories of old men in this day and age. It's all about instant messaging and the latest gadget now. No one cares about the past anymore. This is something everyone should know. It's something that we all knew as children, I think, but have since forgotten and dismissed, as if we somehow outgrew the truth. But this truth, the truth that all children know, we must once again learn to accept. That truth is simple, and it is this: magic exists. There now, I've said it. Go on, laugh. I know you want to. Laugh at this foolish, doddering old man who has lost his mind. Let me tell you, my mind is as sharp as it ever was, even if my hands shake and I can only shuffle around with the aid of a walker. I'll tell you this too. The last laugh will be on me. I used to be like you once. I only believed in what I could see and hear, taste and touch. I would scoff at people who told me all the stories about fairies and other things that sounded silly. Show me the proof, I would say. Show me this winged creature you have on your shoulder. Then I'll believe you. I was a fool, and so are you. The truth is, we all get blind as we get older. We forget all the things that do not make sense, but children just intuitively know. We dismiss everything as false, guilty until proven innocent. I had my eyes opened oh so long ago, and I'm telling you about it so that you too can finally see again. There is nothing left now but for to begin. So here I go. Try to keep an open mind. I know it's difficult for your sort. Kids these days. I was 16 when I signed up to fight. I was nothing more than a Yankee boy with grand ideas of adventure and heroism. Let me tell you, there is nothing heroic about war. It's loud and bloody and hard. You kill people in war. People with families and futures who, just like you, are fighting for what they believe in. You watch your friends die around you, sometimes on you, as little bits of meaty pulp. You eat the brains of the guy in front of you in war, when his head is blown wide open by a bullet of 3. Stupid Tommy. I told him to wear his helmet. He never listened. Limeys, they're all the same. I was fighting in Holland when I was hit by a shell. Well, sort of. Enough that it sent me flying in any case. Little Bobbit caught the worst of it. I can't remember his real name anymore. We just called him Bobbit. He was blown into little, tiny pieces. My last recollection of that fight was a big, bright light and a loud sound, and then silence. I saw the silhouette of Bobbit fly apart before I hit the ground and blacked out. I couldn't tell you how long I was out for. Could have been days. Could have been months. But I wasn't in no military hospital when I woke up. I wasn't still on the field either. I was on a bed. Well, on a thin mattress on a low bench. It was dark when I woke up, and the air was thick and smoky, but cool. I could hear people talking. There was laughter somewhere outside. I frowned and tried to move, only to find out that I'd been bandaged up tight, like a damned mummy in a museum. The only thing I could move was my head, so I did just that, trying to figure out where the hell I was. I couldn't see squat, except one window that opened out into the night sky. It was filled with constellations I've never seen before. The window itself was open to the elements, and the window sill was nothing more than daubed mud that was designed to smooth out the edges of the wattle that made up the walls. Never seen anything like it before, but I was too tired and out of it to do much wondering. The smoke, I remember, was coming from a bowl near the foot of my bed. It was sweet-smelling, and I'm sure it was that smoke that was making me as drowsy as I was. In any case, I didn't have the strength to fight it, so I just let myself fall back to sleep. I only have patchy memories of the first part of my recovery, hazy, vague things that tell me almost nothing about that time, so I'll spare you those particular recollections. When I finally woke up with a clear head, it was mid-morning. There were birds singing somewhere outside. It wasn't any birdsong I had heard before. I looked down. I was covered in woolen blankets, and the bowl at the end of my bed was no longer smoking. The air inside was clear and cool and smelled incredible, like grass and rich, moist earth and flowers. After the smell of gas and oil and metal and the unwashed bodies of the trenches, this was heaven. In fact, I thought I was in heaven, that I had died and some poor angel had stitched my soul back together. Ain't no one's soul without holes in it when you fought a war. Trust me on that score. I stretched, and that's when I realized I wasn't wrapped up anymore. It felt so good to stretch. I spent a long time stretching. When I rolled over, I saw her, my very own angel. Though, mind you, she didn't have no wings. She was beautiful all the same, with long dark hair that hung in loose waves. Her eyes were green like oceans of grass. She wore a red dress that clasped at the shoulders with gold pins. Around both wrists were gold torques set with emeralds. When she saw me awake, she smiled. I thought I was in love. Hell, I was in love. That woman was beautiful. She had been standing at the entrance, which was a rectangular thing, trimmed in mud like the one and only window in this circular hut. A piece of painted hide served as the door. The woman had in her hand a tray with a bowl of rabbit stew on it. Damn, that smelled good. Let me tell you, soldiers' rations are piss. This meal was bliss compared, and I was hungry. And I was so hungry, I barely waited for her to put the tray down before I dug in. I remember burning my tongue, and her laughing at me. I love the way her eyes crinkled at the edges when she smiled. She waited patiently for me to finish eating before she collected the dishes and left. As she exited the hut, a man walked in. He looked like a Swede, to be honest, what with his height and blonde hair. He wasn't wearing a shirt, only high trousers, and was covered in tattoos. Angels with tattoos. Who would have guessed it? He didn't seem quite so pleased with me as the woman was. He said something to me in a language I did not understand. It wasn't Swedish. What? I asked. The man frowned, turned, and left. I shrugged. Wasn't my fault I didn't speak their language. Not sure what to do, I threw the blankets aside and stood. There was no way I was going to stay in bed, what with the sun shining like it was. It took me a moment to realize that I was naked. It was a warm breeze that alerted me to that fact. I looked down at myself. I was covered in scars, and the crinkled skin that covered my right side told me I had been burned pretty badly. The man returned suddenly with clothes bundled in his arms. Well, a pair of trousers at any rate. He handed them to me with a grunt, then left again, just as surly as before. Maybe he was German. In any case, I pulled the trousers on. They were a bit long for me, but otherwise fit quite well. Not knowing what to expect, I walked outside the hut and stopped short. There were just 4 other huts, and one great big rectangular one with stone steps that led up to massive wooden doors. It was a small village, near as I could tell, made up of just 5 families. Well, 6 really, if you include the lucky bastards that got to live in the giant hall. Everyone had gathered at the entrance of the hut, no doubt them being told I was awake now and all. They all just sort of stood there and stared. So, I stood there and stared back. One woman approached after a while. She sniffed me, then poked a strong finger into my rib. "Ow!" I exclaimed. I pulled away, scowling at her with my best angry face. She turned to the crowd and giggled, then walked away. She left a bruise, a great big one, right on my ribs. It was the pretty woman who broke up the staring contest. She clapped her hands sharply and said things in her bizarre language, and, with a collective complaint, the crowd dissipated. The woman smiled and beckoned me to follow her. Ain't no way I was going to say no to this woman. No, sir. She showed me around this little village. It struck me then that there were no roads. There weren't any cars. Not even a bicycle. People walked everywhere, it seemed. And then I noticed the swords. Swords! I mean, some of the limey officers carried swords, but they were small and decorative. The swords these villagers carried were huge things that were as wide as my neck. I didn't understand. Clearly I hadn't died. I wasn't living on a cloud, no one had wings, and there wasn't any harp music. This wasn't heaven. So what then? Had I gone back in time? I must have looked startled, because the woman placed her hand on my arm and looked at me with concern. I tried to smile, but I think it looked more like a crooked grimace. We walked around the village a little more. It seemed everything was shared. There was a pig pen and several cows that munched lazily on the grass and just watched the villagers bustle by in their work. Back behind the huge hall there were 3 fields. One had hops and barley, one had wheat, or something that looked very close to wheat, and the other was currently empty, though chickens were crawling over it like vermin. That night, everyone went into the hall. I had a place of honor, or so it seemed, sitting beside the tall, surly blonde man, who in turn sat next to a massive older man wearing a brass crown. I kid you not, when I tell you this man was huge. He wasn't fat. Every ounce of his mass was muscle and bone. He could have crushed me with just a hug. The pretty woman sat on his other side. The man wearing the crown tried to talk to me several times, but I had no idea what he was saying. He and the blonde man exchanged a quiet word, and the king, what else would you call a man wearing a crown, stopped trying. I ate really well that night, I remember. They ate and drank, and then ate a little more, and spent the rest of the night drinking. I was tired by the end of it, and really glad when the king stood and left. The pretty woman escorted me to bed in my little hut, and then left. The next day I was dragged out of bed and hauled back into the hall by the blonde man. He wasn't very gentle, and I thought I was in trouble. Once outside, I was faced by a woman dressed in white robes and bent with age. She had striking blue eyes and seemed to garner a lot of respect from everyone else. When she looked at me, it was as if she was looking into me. I tell you, it was unnerving. The old woman said something to me. "What?" I replied. She rolled her eyes and stepped forward, poking me between the eyes with a bony finger. These people like to poke. She started talking again. This time, her babbling became slowly comprehensible. "Hello," she was saying. "Hello. Is there anyone in there?" I frowned. "How did you do that?" I asked, rubbing my forehead. "Ah!" the woman said, clapping her hands together. "That's better. The savage can talk." "Savage? I'm not the one living in the Stone Age." The woman cocked her head in a strangely bird-like fashion, then shrugged. "What is your name?" "Doug." "Doug Sheen." "Doug Sheen," the woman said with a yellow-toothed grin. "Why have you come to this village?" I scowled. "I didn't." "Yes, you did," the blonde man growled. "I was riding in when you jumped at me and knocked me off my horse." "I did no such thing," I insisted. "I was on the battlefield, fighting a war. Then something exploded and I woke up here." "Perhaps," the pretty woman said with a smile, "he was thrown onto your horse, husband." Husband. Never been so disappointed in my life. The blonde man grunted. "It is possible," he conceded. "You wear strange clothes," the crone continued. "What kingdom are you from?" "Kingdom? None. I don't live in a kingdom." "That's absurd," the blonde man snapped. "Everyone lives in a kingdom." "Well, I don't. We got rid of kings long ago. I'm from the US. US? The crone repeated, unsure. "Yeah. The US. United States. On a huge continent. You should look it up." "I've never heard of US, the crone said. "Is it in the north?" No. Well, maybe. Are we in Australia? I don't know where we are, so I can't tell you. The crone grunted. The crone grunted. "He might be from the other side," the pretty woman said. The crone looked at her momentarily. "I think you are right. He must be." "The other side? I'm not the enemy," I protested. No, you stupid man," the crone replied. "The other side. Don't you know anything?" I had no idea what she was talking about. I stared blankly at her. "Apparently not," the blonde man grunted, and a few of the onlookers tittered. I glared. The crone sighed. "We shall have to send you back." I nodded. I had a war to fight, after all. "The time has passed, however," the crone continued. "We shall have to wait until next year." Next year? This could not be happening. Ain't no way I'm leaving my friends out there to die without me. "You have to take me back sooner." "We cannot. The divide opens only once a year, and you've missed it. We will have to wait until next year." She turned and walked away. "Hey!" I shouted. "Hey, my friends are out there!" I pointed in a random direction. "They need my help. You have to take me back." The crone turned back and opened her mouth to speak, but it was the pretty woman who spoke instead. "Perhaps the wisps will take him." The crone turned to her and cocked her head in thought. "Perhaps. But who will chance the journey to the Whispering Woods? I am too old to be fighting my way across the country." The pretty woman looked expectantly at her husband, who returned her gaze with a look that spoke defiance in volumes. Those sparkling green eyes of hers could not be resisted for long, and the blonde man sighed. "Fine," he grumbled. "I will take him." The crone shrugged nonchalantly. Of course she would. She didn't give a damn who I went with. I did. I didn't want to be stuck with Mr. No Smile for the entire trip. Surely there must be someone else, I asked. The crone raised her eyebrows at me. Do not be so quick to shun your guide. There is no one else you'd want at your side on a journey like this. Trust me. What else could I do? Squat, that's what. So I just sighed and muttered, fine. The blonde man grunted. We leave tomorrow. He turned to leave. Can I at least have your name? I asked him. He turned back and replied, Madog. It was all I could do to not laugh. Madog woke me up before dawn the following morning. Doug Sheen, he said, squishing my name together. Doug Sheen, time to awaken. Go away, I grumbled. It's still dark. Best time to leave, Madog replied with a grin. Now up. I sighed and threw aside my blankets. I dressed in my trousers and noticed that Madog's usually exposed torso was covered in a chainmail shirt and a hard leather breastplate. He carried a bronze helmet under his arm and was armed to the teeth. Swords and knives of all sizes hung off every possible body part. Expecting trouble? I asked. Madog only grunted. He pointed to where a set of similar armor was folded neatly, along with an array of weapons. Not a single gun amongst them. Let me tell you, for a soldier that only knows how to fire a gun, looking at a pile of swords and knives can be damned intimidating. It was clear I knew nothing about anything to do with armor, and Madog stared in utter disbelief as I tried to put it on. You really know nothing, Doug Sheen, he growled before coming over to help me. We don't have this stuff where I'm from, I growled back. How do you fight without armor? Madog seemed genuinely puzzled at this. Puzzled enough to put aside his hostility for now, at any rate. Thinking about it, it seemed odd that we're facing down guns and Lord knows what else without any protection other than the ability to fire back. We just do. It was all I could reply. Madog grunted and shrugged. He helped me arrange the weapons, sighing with impatience the entire time. The dark night had given away to first light by the time he was done. We go now, he said grumpily. I had thought we were going to ride out of the village, just like the heroes in those ridiculous fairy stories you hear. Not so. We left on foot. We aren't riding? I asked as we left the village behind. Madog shook his head. Horses are needed here. It was just as well. I was a kid from New York, never ridden a horse in my life. For a long time we walked in silence. It was during this walk that I realized why we didn't fight war with armor on. That stuff is damned heavy. I challenge you to walk 5 steps in it, let alone miles and miles. By the end of the day I was exhausted. I collapsed onto the ground and stayed there while Madog, rolling his eyes at me, prepared a fire. We ate salted pork and drank warm water for dinner. I fell asleep immediately afterwards. It seemed too soon when Madog was shaking me awake. It was still too early for the sun. I groaned but stumbled to my feet, staggering as I adjusted to the weight of the armor again. Madog glared at me. Shut up, I grumbled. I heaved on my pack, and we were off again, walking in stony silence. Soon we will come to the hungry grass. Be careful, it may swallow you. And there are biters. Biters? What the hell are biters? Madog just smiled. We crested a small hill and found ourselves before a virtual ocean of tall grass that swayed like seaweed in the wind. I could hear the crisp zip of insect wings as they flitted in and out of the grass. Madog made a face. Biters, he muttered in disgust. Then he turned to me. Walk only where I walk. You're the boss. I had to walk fast to keep up with his long-limbed strides. As we started wading through the grass, we kicked up a whole bunch of insects that buzzed angrily. At first I thought them relatively large wasps, until one settled on my mailed arm. It looked directly up at me with large, insectoid eyes. With a start, I realized that what was settling on my arm, clinging to the mail with tiny hands and feet, was, in fact, a woman. A bright, orange woman with a set of 4 clear wings. Fairies! I exclaimed. I went to pick her up. A mistake. She spun suddenly and sunk razor-sharp teeth into my finger. It stung like fire. Ow! I roared, flinging the creature away. Mad Dog started laughing, but his laughter turned into a roar of pain as a fairy landed on his neck and bit down hard. I laughed until I noticed that the fairies were starting to swarm. "Run!" Mad Dog yelled. I didn't need to be told twice. We hightailed it out of there, running hard for what felt like an hour before the fairies decided that we weren't worth the effort. "Must have had a nest there," Mad Dog said, rubbing the swollen bite on his neck. I could only nod and pant as I tried to get my breath back. "Come," Mad Dog said, slapping my shoulder hard enough to make me want to crumple. I grunted, and Mad Dog and I walked through the fields of tall grass until sunset, when we finally stumbled onto friendlier lawn. Mad Dog grinned at me. "Rest now?" I just grunted again and fell down to the ground, falling asleep instantly. I woke of my own accord just moments after first light to find myself quite alone. My guide was nowhere to be seen. Realizing I was starving, I pulled salted pork and bread from my pack and ate as I sat and waited for Mad Dog to arrive. It was just as the sun was rising that Mad Dog returned, with a grin on his face that turned his features suddenly boyish. "Good, you're awake," he said. "Come, there is something you must see." Frowning, I put on my pack and followed Mad Dog. We got to a hill and Mad Dog turned to me. "Shh," he hushed before crawling on all fours up the side of the hill. I followed, careful to make as little noise as possible. I tell you, it's damn hard to be quiet when your shirt is made of metal. Finally we reached the crest and I peeked over. I could have choked. We were staring at a sizable herd of horses. Only, they weren't quite horses. They were unicorns. "I told you weren't going to believe me. What do you want? That's what I saw." There were unicorns, damn you, and they weren't all white. Sure, there were a couple of white ones, but like the Mustangs back home, they came in all colors, the most common being brown. Mad Dog pointed to a big one, with a massive scar that ran down the length of its neck and down its chest. "That is the stallion," Mad Dog whispered. "Has been for many seasons. But it is rutting season now, and he is getting old. Look, you see that one? The big black?" "Yes." "He is the next contender. See how they are standing? There's going to be a fight." I know what you're thinking, because I thought the same thing. Unicorns are supposed to be all sweet and innocent and pure and some such nonsense, right? Well, I can tell you from first-hand knowledge, they ain't. These beasts are just as feral as wild horses, and it's damned frightening when they fight. I watched in awe as the black one pawed the ground with a cracked hoof, then tossed his head and screamed. The big brown stallion tossed his head in reply. The black lowered his head, so his dangerously sharp horn pointed at the stallion's chest, and charged. I felt for sure that the stallion would be impaled, but he twisted to the side and brought his own horn down hard on the younger unicorn's horn, with an almighty crack. It dipped the black's head unexpectedly, and the beast stumbled. Over and over it went, each unicorn taking their turn to charge. It was ferocious and terrifying, and both beasts earned deep wounds that fight. They twisted and turned and pranced and screamed, coming dangerously close to the hill where Mad Dog and I were hiding. "Too close," Mad Dog whispered. "Time to go." We crawled back down the hill and jogged for a time. Behind me, I heard a piercing scream of victory. I never stopped to look back. I hoped the old stallion won. When Mad Dog thought we were safe enough, we slowed down to a walk again. The unicorn sighting seemed to have loosened Mad Dog's tongue, and we talked for a while. I learned that Mad Dog was the son of a chieftain in a neighboring village, and he had learned all of his battle skills from a woman named Ava, who lived with her daughter on an island not far off the coast. He would be king one day, but it was the current king's daughter who would rule. I told him that I knew people who fought for their king, and that his daughter will rule one day as well. I told him all about the war and why we were fighting it. "I hope it is as they say," I told him, "that this really is the war to end all wars." Mad Dog sighed sadly. There will always be war. People are stupid. I laughed. He was probably right. "Still," I said, "I would like to try." "You are a good person, Dougsheen," Mad Dog said after a long silence. "You're not too bad yourself," I replied with a grin. We walked all day every day for another week. At length we topped a steep hill and looked down over a valley. A small stream snaked its way through that valley. Behind it sat the borders of a forest. The Whispering Woods, Maddox said. Come, let us rest. We will go there tomorrow. It was only midday, but I wasn't about to argue. It had been an odd week and a half. Over that time I had found that, despite his initial frostiness, Maddox was quite a humorous man, and generous as well. I'd miss his company when I went home. The next day, neither of us got up until the sun was well and truly in the sky. Now we go, Maddox said with a grimace after breakfast. I shrugged and stood. What will you do when you go back? Maddox asked as we trudged down the chalk slope. I shrugged. Go back to the fighting, assuming the war didn't end already. Maddox nodded. That is good. Very brave. Many men do not return to war when they are healed. I understand that, I said. Truth be told, going back to the trenches was not my idea of fun, but I owed it to my friends, and all those poor sots that had been blown up before my very eyes. I had to go back. You could stay, Maddox offered. I smiled. Thanks, but I have to get back. Maddox nodded. We walked in silence for the rest of the day. It was evening when we reached the forest's edge. Now what? I asked. Now we wait. For what? Wisps. What is a wisp? That, Maddox said. I turned to look and saw nothing but a small patch of fog floating quietly through the trees. That, I said, is mist. I should have known better than to not believe. Did I not see a grassland filled with fairies? Had I not witnessed unicorns fight? The patch of mist probably heard me and came flying towards us, trees being no obstacle, to stop abruptly in front of us. It remained as formless as any other patch of mist, but all the same, it looked at us with holes for eyes. Wisp of the wood, Maddox said, wanderer's bane. This is Doug Sheen, and he was blown here from the other side. There is a war there, and he has left friends behind. He would return to them. Will you help him? It had never occurred to me before now that the wisps might yet refuse, and I would be stuck here for a year regardless. It was a tense moment as I waited. The answer was vague, nothing more than a sighing yes on the breeze. Maddox nodded. Thank you, he replied, before turning to me. Now listen carefully, he said. Follow this wisp, and only this wisp. Ignore the lights. If you cross the path of another wisp, don't get mixed up. The woods have swallowed many a traveller, never to return. I nodded. Maddox held out his hand, and I mine. He grasped my forearm. Good luck, Doug Sheen, he said. Thank you, Maddox. I turned and with a deep breath followed the wisp, which had started to drift lazily back into the woods. Let me tell you, those woods were frightening. I could hear howling and whispering. It was like I was being followed by invisible people who were talking to each other. I remembered Maddox's advice well, and though the wisp seemed intent on losing me in those woods, I never let it out of my sight. I walked all night until the woods seemed to thin out, and I could smell mud and smoke. The landscape changed suddenly. It was a battlefield, but one long ago abandoned. Grass and poppies covered the ground, ensnaring the barbed wire. I looked around, realizing I had lost the wisp. I turned to check the woods behind me, only to find that there were no woods behind me. I scowled. I looked down at myself and noted that I was in my uniform. It had been washed and mended. It was definitely mine. The crisp, crunching sound of many feet marching in time drew my attention, and I looked up. I sighed with relief when I recognized the badges. 5th Battalion, British Marine Corps. Hey! I shouted. Hey, guys! I ran towards them. Identify yourself! The officer shouted at me. By God, one of the Marines said. It's Sheen! Doug Sheen! Where the hell have you been? That Marine was Victor Kusova, a friend of mine from the trenches. Not a bad limey. but I reckon that's because his granddad was Russian. You will never believe me, I replied. This is no time for jokes, mate. You've been MIA for a year now. I stopped dead and my face fell. A year? It couldn't have been more than a month, recovery time included. All I could do was gape at Victor in astonishment. I was promptly arrested and escorted for debriefing. When I finished my tale, I was told I had delusions and was dismissed from service. Not that it mattered. A week later, the war was over. Apparently, we'd won. They put me in a home for crazy people. Friends came to visit and ask after me, and ask what really happened. After a while, I stopped telling the truth. The truth always made my friends shake their heads sadly. I said I escaped from some prison or something. I said there were no such things as fairies and unicorns, and nothing even remotely like a wisp. There certainly wasn't the other side, where people lived like it was the year zero. After a year of lying my ass off, they let me go. I went back to the battlefield a few times, and just stood there where I'd been found by the 5th. It became a yearly pilgrimage. I saw a wisp once or twice, drifting across the battlefield, the whispering woods shimmering through its form as it drifted past. All that happened some 80 years ago now, but I remember it clear as day. I'm too old now to travel, so I haven't been back there. But I bet there are wisps still floating around, ready to lead people into the woods if they can. You don't have to believe me if you don't want to. I don't care. The truth is, there is such a thing as magic, and all those fairy stories you heard as a kid, I'll bet my ass they're true. You'll see. Have yourselves a lovely afternoon. Bye.